Sounds great. Let me make sure I have all my things here. So today, good morning, everybody. So today we have one item, and it's Bill 13-20, County Property Disposition Affordable Housing. This bill was introduced on March 10th by lead sponsor, Councilmember Jawando. The public hearing was held on July 7th, at which there were no speakers. I do want to welcome the HDA Director, Asim Nigam, as well as Mr. Greg Hassan from DGS, Deputy Director. And I thought I saw Mr. Conklin here from Department of Transportation as well, but everybody, of course, is welcome. So basically, just for way of background, the county property disposition law requires the executive to conduct a reuse analysis, including seeking proposals for use by other outside agencies for the property before issuing a declaration of no further need for real property. The property disposition law requires the council to approve the executive's declaration of no further need for real property valued at more than $100,000. The council must also approve any sale or surplus real property proposed by the executive for less than the fair market value. And then finally, the law permits the executive to dispose of real property valued at more than $100,000 as suggested without council approval if the buyer agrees to build at least 30% moderately priced dwelling units, also known as NPDUs, or other price-restricted affordable dwelling units. And so this bill will change the 30% moderately priced housing exemption from voluntary to mandatory. Any disposition that is being used primarily for housing would automatically be required to include at least 30% of the dwelling units as NPDUs under Chapter 25A. The exemption from the process described above would only apply if 15% of the dwelling units are standard NPDUs available for residents at 65% or 70% of area median income, depending on unit type, and 15% of the dwelling units are NPDUs available for residents with an income of 50% or less of area median income. And there is a memorandum that Councilmember Jawando has shared. I believe that's on Circle 6. And so that is the gist, basically, of the proposal before us. I do want to also acknowledge that Councilmember Jawando is here as well. And what I like to do then is ask Mr. Drummer to go through the packet. Before we do that, though, Councilmember Jawando, if you'd like to make some comments regarding the bill as the lead sponsor, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Navarro, and good to be joining GO. I'm in my office. My computer's being a little funky, so I'm on the phone, but hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, you went over it very well. Just want to remind folks two things. Obviously, the Cod Goals. This bill was, I can't remember. I think it was, the time runs together, but right at the beginning, before we jumped into the pandemic, so it kind of got caught up in all of that. But obviously, we have the Cod Goals that we've all affirmed. 75% need to be affordable units. We've all talked about a lot that leveraging county-owned land is a big way and a big opportunity for us to get affordable units. I just did want to note also that the Coalition for Smarter Growth did submit written testimony, Jane Lyons, which is in the packet, and they are supportive of this legislation. They actually wanted us to go a step further, which I didn't propose, and to require, make it mandatory that this happen within certain parts of transit, making affordable housing on county-owned land mandatory. So that's something we might talk about in the future, but not at issue here. But I think this is a smart, to use Councilmember Navarro's term, a tool in the toolbox for us to leverage affordability and deeper levels of affordability when we have the most skin in the game. So hope that we can move it forward, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today.
Thank you. And for my colleagues, if you want to just raise your hand, or just also colleagues in the committee, just text me, either one works. Mr. Drummer, any additional particular observations regarding the proposal? I know you have a really great packet. I sort of just read part of it.
Well, I mean, you explained the bill. I mean, it changes what's currently the 30% affordable housing is an exception to the requirements that the council approve the disposition, and it changes it to mandatory. Right now, it's, depending on where the property is, it's 12.5 or 15%. And it creates a new exception where the council wouldn't have to approve it if you have the 30% affordable, but 15% at a lower rate, affordable to 50% area median income or less, and 15% at the standard NPDU rate. And it has to be NPDUs as well, which have a longer retention or control period than some of the other tax-advantaged affordable housing options. The OMB and the OLO did fiscal impact statements and economic impact statements. The fiscal impact statement is inconclusive. Obviously, if you're going to require more affordable housing and you're disposing of property, you're likely to get, if you're selling the property, you're going to get less money for it, I suppose, because everything is in the wash as far as investors trying to make money on the project. But it's difficult to know how much. And it's also possible that the developers would require that in order to dispose of property, it may require somebody to, a developer to request some assistance, like from the housing and the HIF fund or something like that. But we don't know, and we're not really sure, and it depends on the property and where it is. The same with the economic impact statement. More affordable housing is clearly good. It's one of the policy goals. We're talking about county property. We're not talking about every place, in the county. This is a requirement just for when we sell property that we no longer need. I think OLO also pointed out that if the costs go up for this type of development, it could increase the rents in the area. So that's the fiscal and economic impact of the bill. The real question here is, the goal is to have more NPDUs. And if you end up with more developments with 30% NPDUs instead of 15, that'll work. If you've created a system that people don't want to buy the land to, or don't want to do a development on there because it's too expensive, then you may get less NPDUs. There's really no way to know how it's going to ultimately play out without, in my mind, without trying it. I will say this was introduced before we required a racial impact statement, but just a quick look by me and not by OLO. To the extent you have more affordable housing, that's going to have a positive impact on racial impact, on racial equity and social justice. It clearly will. So I think we all probably know that. So there also are some suggested changes, clarifications really from the county attorney's office. A couple of them are just technical. One of them I did want to mention is, and this is in existing language, it's not new for this bill, but it talks about development that's used primarily for housing. And it was pointed out by the county attorney's office that we really ought to define what we mean by primarily. And I agree, we should. And I put in a definition, which what it means to me, it means more than half, but you could change that to anything you want. I guess the higher you go, the more people will be able to develop without 30% affordable housing. So keep that in mind. But the definition I suggested is used primarily for housing means more than 50% of the gross floor area of all buildings in the project will be used for dwelling units. Looking at floor area of building seemed to be a reasonable way to go to me. And the other suggested changes, the county attorney's office suggested that the first one is primarily. The second one they suggested was that we put in a clarification that the agreement with the county has to comply with the moderately priced dwelling unit program established in 25A. That's just a clarification. And also, it shouldn't be an agreement with DHCA. Technically, legally, it's an agreement with the county as approved by DHCA. Those are minor technical changes. They also suggested that we spell out when we reference subsection D, we spell out exactly what that means. I think that I disagreed with that suggestion. I think subsection D is right there in front of you, and just to repeat it again is probably either refer to it or you have to repeat it completely, and I think that makes no sense legislative drafting wise. And then the county attorney's office recommended we use the term income control period, and they suggested, which makes sense, that the defined term in the regulation is control period. And so we take out the word income. And also the bill as drafted this was mine, the last technical amendment, includes area median income, a definition of area median income, which is good and should be in there. But it's placed within the section that uses the term, and there is a subsection that has definition, so I would move it there. That's simply a legislative drafting item. It doesn't change the words. But the real issue here that I see is, do you want to, what do you think is going to happen? I will point out that, Mr. Giwando pointed out the support for the bill. There was some correspondence from attorneys representing the Broad Branch development in downtown Bethesda working on parking lot. And I characterized it as oppose the bill. They wrote in yesterday and said, no, we don't oppose the bill. We just want you to exclude our development. I consider that opposing the bill. It's okay as long as it's, their point is that there may be other public benefits from the project, and they listed some of the public benefits in their project that they say you can't have if you go to 30% MPDUs. And, because it just doesn't work financially. And I know we've got representatives from the executive branch who maybe can explain that. We actually don't have a position from the executive on this bill. At least I didn't see it. I came in the middle of this bill, but I didn't see a position from the executive branch. So, but obviously Mr. Conklin is here, and Mr. Assant, Mr. Nadam are here to explain what, if any, position the executive has on this, or to at least answer questions about the bill. So that's basically the bill, and that's where we're at.
Great. All right, so maybe let's hear from Mr. Assant. I'm just going to ask those who have their microphones not muted to go ahead and mute them, just to avoid background noise. And then if you're speaking, of course, you can. Mr. Assam.
Great. Good morning, Madam Chair and council members. Again, Greg Oz, Department of General Services. As you know, DGS handles a lion's share of property dispositions for the county, but also here, Directors Nagam and Conklin. Asim is here for obvious reasons, and Chris is here to answer specific questions about some of the correspondence that you received and specific projects that Bob just alluded to. And we can certainly answer questions about those. First and foremost, fundamentally, the county executive doesn't have any concerns with using county land to leverage more affordable housing and increase the affordable housing stock in the county. I think you've seen that in some of the projects that he has sent over, and certainly in many of the projects that he has supported in the past. I appreciate Mr. Drummer's overview because he hit on some of the things that we'd like to reiterate today, and specifically within the fiscal impact statement, which I believe is on page 12 of your packet. And in that, each of these projects is unique, and so the financial structures are unique. And when the cash flows are impacted by the varying degree of affordable housing, there is typically a value reduction. And sometimes that lessens our ability to provide other public benefits aside from affordable housing. In the case of where in the fiscal impact statement, I think the example of a PLD lot was used in replacing public parking as part of a project. And Director Conklin can go into more detail on how that works for the PLD. So that's really one point we wanted to reiterate. As it relates to the bill specifically, the 30% NPDU requirement, that's a fairly straightforward calculation for us. That's not something that we're unfamiliar with, something that we can quantify in fairly short order, project by project, to determine before a project moves forward, just exactly what that fiscal impact will be, and as it relates to the project overall, and how that 30% NPDU, which is very defined, impacts the financials of the project. What's a little bit harder to do as it relates to the bill specifically is calculating that additional 15% of that component at or below 50% AMI. And so there's a lot of wiggle room in there, whether it's all at 50% or a varying degree. I'll just use the Bushy Drive, which is a closed school disposition, so it's a little bit of different process, and these regs wouldn't apply to that because it's a closed school. But as you saw, the executive's proposal for Bushy Drive has varying degrees of affordability, 30, 40, 50% of AMI. And while we understood what that means for the project, we were really underwriting the financials on that as a county-owned piece of land. But in a private development project, perhaps not with an affordable housing partner per se, that would be a lot harder to tell. So working with a developer and trying to ascertain just exactly how that impacts their cash flows and their financials is a harder task. And so without having that available, without having done the analysis and having that in front of us, it leaves a little bit of a question mark as to what the financial impacts, and the executive believes that some additional analysis would be warranted on something like this before a regulation were to change. Again, 30% NPDU, a little bit easier for us to calculate, but the added affordability below 50% or 50 or below AMI is a much taller task, and we haven't had the opportunity to do the analysis, and we didn't see anything in the packet from OLO or others to really try to start to quantify that. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but if you'd like to hear from Directors Nagam and Conklin, I'll hand it off to one or both of them.
Yeah, I'd like to do that, and then we'll go back. I know Councilmember Joanda has a couple of questions, but I'd like to just hear from everybody first, and then we can engage in the question and answer. Let's see, Director. Should we go to Mr. Conklin, Director Conklin first, and then Mr. Director Nagam?
Good morning. I am also having some IT challenges, so I'm joining you from my phone as well. Yes, it's very common that we enter into redevelopment projects on county land, and DOT really deals with two different types. One is in the parking lot districts, and the second is fragments of right-of-way. Sometimes right-of-way is also owned in fee simple. So there are two components to those. There's an abandonment and then a disposition. I know of at least 3 projects that are in various stages of negotiation that could potentially be affected by this. And one of them is the Bethesda Market, which is the Farm Women's Market area redevelopment, where we have been in discussion with adjacent owners for about 1.5 years about the structure of a project there. And we know that the financing and cash flow for that project will be challenging. There's a substantial investment in public facilities there, replacement of essentially no-cost surface parking with relatively expensive below-grade parking. And that parking has, through the public process, it's been identified that that parking is indeed wanted and needed by the businesses and adjacent community in that area. So it really is a fundamental component of that project. And then secondly, that project is delivering significant parkland in that part of Bethesda. It will be restoring the surface of the Farm Women's Market site and integrating it into a large public park that spans all of what's existing parking lot 10 and a significant portion of what's parking lot 24, which is immediately behind the Farm Women's Market. We think we need to rely on the entire appraised value without a 30% affordability requirement for that property in order to close the gaps in the financing that we expect for that. You also received correspondence, as Mr. Drummer mentioned, from Broad Branch, and we are not yet in negotiation here. We have issued a request for proposals because there are multiple entities that have expressed interest in redeveloping 2 parking lots also in Bethesda, in the northern part of Bethesda near West Virginia Avenue. And it's almost an identical concept to what I described for the Farm Women's Market, where 2 smaller surface lots would be consolidated into one public parking facility below grade. And while those are more expensive, it is the express purpose of the PLD to improve the urban environment and to support revitalization of these areas. So, and the below-grade parking structures are a key component of that, making better use of the land above and creating tax income and the urban environment we're looking for. And that project would also be delivering both the below-grade parking garage and substantial public parks that are all called for in the downtown Bethesda master plan. And much like Farm Women's Market, we know that it will be difficult to achieve a reasonable financing plan for this project, and further requirement for a percentage of affordable housing in those projects will affect the value of the land and ultimately the ability to close any gaps to finance that project. The third that I'd like to mention is in White Flint, where we are currently building the Western Workaround, which is a realignment of Old Georgetown Road and Executive Boulevard and creation of an urban street grid. There are agreements in place related to exchanges of what's currently Old Georgetown Road right-of-way, which is fee simple, so it also goes through both the disposition and abandonment process in exchange for dedication of Grand Park Avenue right-of-way. And again, those types of arrangements have been made with a certain expectation of how much affordable housing is anticipated to be required in this development. So changing that has the potential to impact the economics of the private party that's engaged in that and may create some additional challenges. So in the end, I think I just am echoing what Mr. Assant said, that each of these potential transactions related to county-owned property is very different. And they all have different public benefits. Some have parks, some have roads, some have provision of additional right-of-way, some have below-grade parking, and the economics of them are complicated, and some are more challenging, some are less challenging. The other thing that I just want to highlight for the committee is that almost none of what I've described to you today is in a new development that's entirely on a piece of county property that's been made available for private use. Almost all of them are a small portion of private use on what's currently private county property, and the majority of those developments are on parcels that are controlled otherwise by the entities that are developing the project. So it's not exactly, as simple as it seems that you're selling a lot to a private party and they're building a project. Most of the time, they're combining a few parcels, and many times the county component of that is a fragment of right-of-way or a piece of a parking lot, and the rest of that parking lot's being used for other purpose. So it's a fairly complicated set of issues to deal with.
Thank you so much, Mr. Conklin. Director Conklin, Director Nigam?
Good morning, everyone. This provides an opportunity to us to provide units at or below 50% of AMI. So we certainly welcome that opportunity. And as I mentioned previously in different forums, anytime we get that opportunity, let's grab that opportunity. That being said, as you know, DSC has been very good in terms of negotiating deeper affordability, whether it was Bushy Drive project or let's say, Willow Manor grand opening, wherein the executive and CM Hucker just went with me a couple of days ago. This is also county-owned property. So DSA has been very successful in negotiating with the developers, not only deeper affordability in terms of AMI levels, but also in terms of overall affordable number of units as such. So what we would like to see is, this amendment doesn't hamper our county's ability to get deeper affordability and also more number of units. That also being said, as you heard, from Mr. Assand and Mr. Conklin, that once you have this requirement, it remains to be seen how much impact it will have on the appraised value of the county-owned land. And it's difficult to put a dollar figure on it because each transaction is unique. In my 28 years of career in affordable housing, I've not seen two transactions which have been alike. I've done all these developers throughout this country. So it's difficult to put a number on this aspect as such. So if the whole premise of the county is to leverage county land to the maximum extent and to get the maximum value out of the land, of course, when the appraiser does value the land with 30% MPDU requirement, it will put a damper on the value of the land. So I want the committee to know what the implications would be. We do not have data as such because each transaction is different. So it remains to be seen what ultimate, affordable housing transaction will look like, what the mixed use will look like. But certainly below grade parking costs more than, above grade parking. I can tell you from my prior experience across the river, if above grade parking space costs, let's say $10,000, the same parking spot below grade may cost $36,000 to $40,000. And this is widely advertised on Virginia Housing website. So certainly, if you're talking about Bethesda area, so below grade parking is a lot more expensive. 30% AMI rent differential in Bethesda area will be a lot more than in East County, let's say Willow Manor project that I just referenced to. So it remains to be seen how this will impact a specific project. So we just hope that county's ability to negotiate deeper affordability in terms of AMI and also in terms of number of units doesn't get diminished by this amendment. So that's all I intend to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So is there anybody else from the executive side that wants to speak? We've heard from everyone, I think. Okay, Councilmember Jawanda.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the comments from the executive branch. So you gave me a lot to chew on there. I have a lot of questions. I guess I want to start with Bob. The primarily definition as at 51%, I kind of saw Mr. Assant nodding at that was a reasonable definition. I don't want to put a word in your nod, but is that does that seem reasonable as far as the amount of housing? And this is an important question because I think it's connected to some of the other issues that were raised.
Certainly, and I'll also ask Director Nagam to opine on this one, but certainly my nod was the affirmative that I understand what more than 50% means, right? So from the inception of the property disposition bill many years ago, this primarily term was floating around then, and this is another opportunity for us to get some clarity on what that exactly means. But to Bob's point during the opening, that number could be 50, or excuse me, more than 50, or 60 or 70, whatever. But I don't know that the executive has a specific number in mind, but certainly 50% is something that we understand. It's what WMATA uses as part of their definition, and certainly other jurisdictions.
Got it. Yeah. So it's kind of it's a standard practice for other similarly situated folks.
I think that's fair.
And the reason that's important, I think, is because of some of the comments that were made after. If for example, in the case of the PLD, and Mr. Conklin, it looks like maybe his phone, he's off, but I can come back to him. But there you are. Okay. If it's the case of so two things. If it's not being used primarily for housing, so in the case of the parks, right? If you're using if a development, now maybe this doesn't happen a lot, but if it's not going to be at least half housing, then this would not apply, right? So that's one thing. And I don't know the specific projects you're talking about. Maybe they are, but and I don't know if the finances would work and someone would come in with a project that was less than 50%. I don't know the likelihood of that, but that was one thing that occurred. And then if you could also respond to that, please, whoever, Mr. Conklin or whomever. And then the other thought I had was how much county land is involved. And you made the point, Mr. Conklin, that if it's just a surface parking lot and the overall, what is the percentage of the county contribution to this fragmented deal? And could we set a threshold if it's not, Bushy Drive is a lot different than a surface parking lot, right? And so depending on how much county land is in the deal, that could be a trigger as well, potentially. So I'm just kind of floating that as an idea to address some of the things that you're talking about. I do think that, let me pause there because I gave you two things. So go ahead.
Sure. I think the language refers to the building, and typically the building, Mr. Drummer can correct me if I'm wrong, but the building is generally the inhabited space, not including the parking area. The parking area is usually thought of as an ancillary use, not one of the primary uses in a structure. And it doesn't really account for the amount of building on a site, in comparison to the open space. So I think those are some of the challenges in figuring out how it applies. And I think the way it's written now, it would apply to whatever the above grade occupied use is without accounting for those other elements of the project. And then in terms of the lot size, I don't know how to give you a threshold that's reasonable, but you are correct that the things that I've described are obviously very different than the wholesale redevelopment of a county-owned piece of property is kind of a standalone activity. But they are all subject to the same disposition process. So if you wanted to pursue a way to differentiate those, that would take some work to figure out what the appropriate thresholds and language are.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's something that occurred to me that something might be worthwhile to look at. And then, Mr. Sant, the other thing I wanted to mention with you is on the fifth. You said the 30%. That's a known number. You're able to factor that in. Just wanted to be clear that on the 15 and 15, this does not require that. This just allows you all not to have to come back to us to get approval for that.
Right, understood, and we appreciate that, and that's very clear in the bill, and I don't want to dismiss that. But as the law currently states, the 30% NPDU threshold that was established by council a number of years ago is the elective threshold at this point, and now it's becoming mandate under the proposed bill. So if you take the long view on these types of things, they tend to evolve over time as the needs of the county changes and as the affordable housing needs change. And so we just want to be upfront on the fact that what is elective today may be mandate at a future point in time. And
Yeah.
so we
Right.
just want to get that on the table.
So you're saying when the next Will Jawando introduces that 20 years from now, that makes that mandatory. I got it.
But I don't know if it's 20, but yeah.
So last thing, thank you, Madam Chair, is just I would be open to some sort of analysis that Mr. Conklin talked about, where we looked at understanding this. If there's different sizes and amounts of land, which would take some more analysis, the threshold amount of how much is being used for primarily, if it needs to go up a little bit. I think all those are discussion points that we could explore. But I did want to say, I do think it's important to say that, we think, Mr. Nagam mentioned this, in the more expensive areas to build, I think this is even a more important principle, that we want to have maximum affordability. And if we need to subsidize that in some way, which we'd be doing, I understand the land cost, but I think making a really strong statement that we think that's an important priority, that anywhere in the county that there's public land, that we leverage it for maximum mixed income and inclusivity, I think is really important. And so I don't, that doesn't necessarily require a response, but as we went through specific projects, and I think Mr. Nagam mentioned it, this would be more of an issue in Bethesda than it would necessarily maybe be in White Oak or something. But I think it's still we want to make sure that we maximize affordability in both. And if we have to bring more money to the table, or if that factors into the analysis of the sale, so be it. But I think it's an important policy objective. So those are my comments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Jawando. Let me just, I'm just going to, I guess, share sort of how I come at this. So in 2012, I was a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I guess Mr. Asan was there around that time and remembers. And this was not a popular proposal at all. And the reason why it wasn't a popular proposal was because there was a sense, obviously there were two sides. So some of us in the council felt that in our oversight capacity, it was important to have at least an opportunity to understand what it was that the executive had negotiated and what the use perhaps would be, and so that we would have an opportunity to at least make that point and at least chime in. There were council members that felt that this was adding an unnecessary layer that would further restrict the ability for the executive, who is the person that actually negotiates deals, that it would hinder that. And that actually worked against our broad policy goals, because what we did not want to do is put more roadblocks in order for the executive to be able to negotiate deals that would, further a policy agenda for the county, given that each deal is different. And so in GO, it was actually a 2-to-1 vote because, there was that split. It actually ended up passing 6-3. And I was sensitive to that at that time. And it was because there was a lot of deliberation around this. I was sensitive to the fact that every deal is different, every proposal is different, and that when we start putting in place additional requirements, it takes away the flexibility and the value of the possibility of that proposal. There is another layer to this, which has to do with something that I've been on the record since I ran for office, which is that at least in my district, we have been fortunate to have a lot of market affordable housing that's available. We've been working hard to bring amenities that this district deserves. And I know it's one of my mantras, which is why I push so hard for revitalization. And for example, Wheaton worked so hard for the White Oak Science Master Plan, worked so hard for so many of the other areas in my district to figure out how we can position, particular possibilities to bring more amenities. And so my concern with this proposal, albeit the fact that it is, it's a worthy goal, and it's one that I'm obviously been very involved in, which is housing. My concern is that what it does is precisely what my colleagues who voted against the disposition bill in 2012 were saying. They were saying we should not be restricting the ability for the county executive and his staff to come up with the best possible negotiation to further our goals. And as land and property, et cetera, becomes more and more scarce, there may be the need to be flexible in terms of how we leverage that particular asset. And so in principle, that's why for me, I can't support this, because it does go against what I said in 2012 would not happen, which was, no, this is not about restricting. This is not about adding more layers. This is not about, making it harder. This is just for us, the council, to have an opportunity to provide just this oversight function of, okay, this deal, pretty cool. It is furthering our policy goals, or heaven forbid, one day we have an executive that kind of goes out there and does something a little bit crazy for us to say, whoa, this just does not align. But other than that, to begin to be so prescriptive, to me, it doesn't honor the spirit of the law that I co-sponsored and that I voted for. And that's why I can't support, this kind of additional things, because again, to me, it just ties our hands in a time where we're trying to actually leverage as much as possible, and find ways to make it so that whatever property, whatever land, etc., becomes very valuable and allows us to further our goals. So I just wanted to share that bit of history, because again, I remember this very clearly. I was lobbied very hard by my other colleagues who voted against it, and I stood very firm, because for me, the issue of oversight was important. Never saw this as a bill for us to then prescribe and make it rigid. So again, I very much appreciate the spirit of the proposal, but it just doesn't align with what I voted for back in 2012. With that, let's see, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the history, and I was going to, credit you with the disposition law that we currently have and all the leadership on that. It does make sure that the council has a significant role in this process, and a public role in this process, and a formal role in this process. And given our emphasis and focus on affordable housing, I really do think that is one of the key areas where we can ensure that this priority is achieved. I also really appreciate Councilmember Jawando's interest and effort here. I think we all share the same goal, which is to maximize affordable housing broadly and specifically on county-owned property. I think the question is whether or not this makes it more likely or less likely, and whether or not this adds a tool that we don't otherwise have. I think the tool already exists, but also comes with flexibility currently. And just wanted to turn to Mr. Assant and just get a sense, currently on the deals that you are looking at and you are negotiating, what are you looking to do with affordable housing? Are you only looking to do 15% currently? If this bill passed, would that emphasis change? Would you look to do more affordability because this bill requires it?
So if my memory is correct, I don't think we've ever brought a project over for a county disposition that included the minimum MPDU requirement. I believe that we have always exceeded it, and well exceeded the affordable housing standards or requirements under 25A. That said, and I would wholeheartedly agree with everything Councilmember Navarro just said about the history and the oversight purview element of this. The executive branch, and again, if my memory is correct, has never brought forth a disposition that has disappointed council and not been approved as a result of the terms of the deal. I believe that we've always put, the executive branch has always put its best foot forward in achieving the public needs and amenities and whether that's affordable housing, whether that's public parking, whether that's economic development, and whether that's parkland. There are a number of different things in the mix with each of these individual projects, and I believe that we try to put together the best deal that we can using and leveraging county land as to the maximum extent possible to deliver those public goods and amenities. So I think that's always been our position, at least the two administrations that I've served, and we've always brought forth good projects since the inception of this bill in 2012. I'll stop there, but I did want to answer and circle back on Councilmember Jawando's question about floor area and how a project is purview in the 50%. And if you just as an example, if you have a redevelopment project with a piece of county land and the result is 100,000 square feet of multifamily apartments and in a courtyard or a park amenity as part of that, the park is not counted in the floor area. And as Chris mentioned, neither is the parking garage. And so that would be 100% housing project, if that makes sense. So that's generally how it's calculated, and a lot of these projects, even if you're mixing and matching the different amenities and things that go with the housing project, they're all going to result, for the most part, unless you have ground floor retail or a community center or something along those lines, or a daycare, which would not be housing. But primarily, that's the general rule.
Well, you're better even than I had thought, and I have very high regard for you, because my second question you just answered before I even had the ability to ask it, related to parking and parks and other amenities. So appreciate that. I think that's an important point here, and one of the challenges that perhaps this is overly prescriptive, although the intention is certainly right. The only other thing that I would say, my sense, and I have Mr. Assant can speak to this, because we've been in many meetings and I have been animated in many of those meetings talking about co-location, talking about maximizing affordable housing on public lands, asking why we're not doing more on some of the parcels that we are. And my sense is it's not that the deals that we do have too little affordability or not enough deep affordability. I think generally the deals that we actually do are great deals. And, and I think to Mr. Assant's point, the council, at least in the short time that I've been here, tend to be very happy and very excited on those. What is the frustration and the consternation is that we want there to be more deals. We want there to be more of these opportunities. And my concern is more limitations, taking certain tools out of the toolkit to be creative on doing these deals would make it less likely, which to me is the biggest concern when it comes to maximizing affordable housing on public lands, maximizing co-location of affordable housing on public land. So I just think that that's an important piece as well. So I totally appreciate the intention here. I don't believe I can support it. I associate myself with many of the comments of the chair. And just lastly, we'll say we are really lucky to have Mr. Assant, Mr. Conklin, Mr. Nagam, and Demaray. We have really talented people to be able to negotiate these deals, to be creative, to think about that. I think it's one of the great luxuries that we have in Montgomery County that most other local jurisdictions don't. And we have a current law that provides clear guidance, provides a role for the county, but allows our best players to have the full playbook. And I think that is the right balance currently in order to maximize this massive public policy goal. Thanks.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned how great they are, because I'm really looking forward to a renegotiation for the residential component, the Lot 13 Wheaton project, because it didn't happen precisely because it was hard to make the financing work. So I'm hoping that we can take a look at that again. Council President Katz.
Thank you very much. You know, I too agree that they're wonderful and do a very, very good job. And of course, Mr. Nagam and Mr. Conklin, I want to say that very publicly. However, I get one of my great pleasures in life about teasing Greg Assant. So I really don't want to give that much of, no, I'm teasing. He's done a wonderful job, not just for Montgomery County, but for Gaithersburg before he came to Montgomery County. And Gaithersburg was very sorry to lose him then, but of course, now that I've changed teams, I'm very glad he's here with us as well. You know, let me just start out by saying that I too appreciate Councilmember Jawando's legislation. I think that I agree with the concept. However, we have heard on so many topics, not just this one size does not fit all. And today is another day that comes true. When selling county-owned property, as has been pointed out several times today, when selling county-owned property, we should be able, the county owns the property, they should be able to negotiate with flexibility to get the absolute maximum affordable housing and other amenities that we can possibly get. And that is something that they need to do, but it has to be on a case-by-case basis. One size does not fit all. I'm concerned, candidly, that if we do it this way, the way this legislation is written, that in fact we will get less affordable housing because we will find developers and others walk away and say, I can't afford it. And so therefore, no percentage of zero is never helps. To replace surface parking with the public parking, as Mr. Conklin pointed out, is not that different from the conversation yesterday about WMATA property. The difference of expense of the WMATA property versus the properties that don't have to have parking garages, parking amenities that are open to the public and are very expensive to build. So there again, I'm in favor of the concept of the legislation. I am not in favor of the legislation. And I believe that we need to keep in mind that the Montgomery County owns the property. They should have the flexibility to negotiate to the nth degree so that we can get all of the amenities and all of the affordable housing that we can possibly get from that piece of property on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Councilmember Jawando.
All right. Well, we know where this is going, but I appreciate the opportunity to join. I think it's important to point out, and I respect all my colleagues, and I really appreciate that we share the goal here. I think everyone on the call wants the goal to happen. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, you set a marker, right? You know, at one point in 1950 there was no marker for MPDUs, didn't exist, and we set a marker, you know, and we said it was going to be 12.5% in the 70s or whenever it was that we passed the MPDU law. And then we set a different marker in the last council of, well, in certain areas where it's more expensive, we should do 15%. And we set a marker, and that's baked into the cost of doing business. There's no, Mr. Assant has no flexibility on any county-owned project to not produce, that's going to produce housing. They have to produce 15%. And the market adjusted to that. And any developer or any proposed project that comes forward knows that that's what if you're going to do work in Montgomery County, that's what you have to do. And you have to make the financials, and you have to go to your investors, and you have to set the expectation. All the things that are part of the process are based on knowing that's part of the process. And I think, so, you know, that's what this would do in a very limited scenario where we have the most leverage, where we have skin in the game, where we have property that we own, that we're saying it is such an important public policy objective that we are going to say this is the rule of the game for when we have county-owned property and it's primarily used for housing. It's so important to our racial equity objectives, so important to our housing affordability objectives, that this is what it's going to be. And the market will adjust. You know, people will come with different proposals. We might have to put some money in to assist on a case-by-case scenario. And that would happen over time. I think that is a risk and calculation worth doing, as we've done with other things. We don't have maximum flexibility now. You have to do 15%. And so I think we're at a point that this is an appropriate step. Obviously, I know my colleagues don't agree with this approach, but I just think it's important to note that. And, because, we have to do something here on affordability. We're not going to get to our affordability goals. We're not going to get anywhere close to them if we don't do something different than what we're doing. And to Councilmember Katz, one of my best friends on the council, the one size fits all. I agree with you, but we just overturned a veto yesterday saying one size does fit all, 100% for 15 years, one size for every metro. And I think, so I think we have to, maybe this isn't the solution, and I would like to work with Director Conklin. Obviously, the bill's not going to move forward today, but I'd like to work with Mr. Hassan and Director Conklin. Maybe we can come back with something different at a later point that looks at some of the calculations that I'd suggested, and maybe it can be a more moderate proposal. But I'm in the maze with you. I want to figure it out. I don't claim to have all the solutions, but we have to do something different. And so this was an attempt to try to move that bar a little forward. And I truly appreciate all three of my colleagues in GO. And we'll keep trying to figure it out. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Javando. As you said, I think we are all on record supporting these goals. We've adopted resolutions. We've done a lot of things. And, in this particular instance, I just think that it's important for folks to understand that this particular law is about oversight. It's not about being prescriptive, and it's not to be used in that particular way. Precisely because we want to reach these goals, the flexibility that we allow the executive with a number of parameters, I think it's what's going to get us there. And so I appreciate your creativity in looking at different ways. I just don't think that this is not the vehicle, in my opinion, because it could actually have unintended consequences, which would be to make it even more difficult. I think that, if folks had adjusted along the way, we wouldn't have the housing crunch that we have. And so there are a lot of moving pieces, but I do appreciate the sentiment and the effort. I just don't believe that this is the tool for the kind of goals that we have set to achieve. I think the SSB is providing us with some interesting opportunities to push the envelope and be really bold. And so, just wanted to say that. Let's see, Council President Katz, before we wrap up.
Right, and I want to prove once again that friends can disagree, and I appreciate that, Councilmember Javando. I do believe that the discussion yesterday proved that one size does not fit all. You're looking at it through a different viewpoint, and I certainly respect that. But what we said yesterday was that property was not county-owned property that we discussed. It was owned by Metro, owned by WMATA, and they had different set of circumstances, and that's why I was supportive of that yesterday. This is what we're discussing today, county-owned property, and we should have flexibility on each piece of property that the county owns. That was my point. Thank you for always creating a good discussion with me and everyone else. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, so I think that I am, what I'm hearing is that the committee is not in favor of advancing the bill. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That is correct. So I think without objection, we will reject, not advance the bill to full council. It'll be the 3-0. And we'll keep working on finding all kinds of creative solutions for, this vexing issue, but really do appreciate Councilmember Javando joining us and also introducing this. I think it's been a really important conversation. And also appreciate Mr. Austin, Director Conklin, Director Nigan, Mr. Demarais, and Mr. Drummer for all your work. And we'll keep at it. Thank you so much, everybody. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.